Good evening and welcome to the March 23rd, 2021 Gilroy Central School District Board of Education meeting. Would you all please silence your cell phones and recite the pledge? Pledge of allegiance to the
To the
flag
flag
of the United
of the
States of
United
America,
States of America
and the
and
republic
the republic for which it stands,
one
one
nation
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible, with
liberty and
liberty
justice
and
for all.
justice for all.
Okay, so we have one item on our agenda tonight, which is the superintendent's draft budget presentation. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Wiles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera. So let me just talk a little bit about the game plan for this evening, and this may give our special guest a chance to get settled in. So Dr. Rivera, you are correct. Tonight, we only have a single item, and that is for our Assistant Superintendent for Business and I to spend some time presenting our entire budget for the 21-22 school year. And our plan will be to share all that information with you and then be ready to take some questions at the end of the presentation from all of our board members. And then I'll just let our community members who are watching know that this evening we'll also be launching a thought exchange out to all of our stakeholders through which they can submit their questions about the budget that we will address 1 week from tonight when we come back for further Q&A and for the actual workshop on the budget. We have used different formats to gather those questions, but the thought exchange automatically categorizes them for this, so it helps us do that as efficiently and effectively as possible. So it has not been launched just yet, but it will be later this evening, and I will give a high sign when that's the case. So that's our plan from the district side. And then earlier today, I heard from our assembly member's office, and Pat Fahey was available to come and give us an update about the state budget from her bird's eye view. In that this at this very, very busy time, I know for all of our lawmakers who are downtown. So Pat, did I vamp long enough? Are you good?
Yes, and you are hands free, but I'm just gonna say I'm just about to pull into my driveway. Thank you for accommodating me here at the very last minute. This is probably the earliest night that we've had in some weeks, and I don't think I need to tell any of the audience that this is February and March are always the most insane months of the year. But anybody who's reading the newspapers knows that it has been layered on with, suffice it to say, I guess, scandal after scandal. So it has just been a roller coaster extraordinaire to kind of keep up with things and be articulate on a number of things while making sure we are still passing bills and really keeping all feet to the fire to try to get an on-time budget. So a couple of things, and then I really do welcome questions. But let me start with the good news. We thought this would be one of the most dismal years after one of the most difficult years I have to assume of anybody's lifetime, certainly of mine. With the COVID nightmare has just been beyond the beyond on so many levels, and my heart goes out to the children in particular, but um, all the school staff, all the teachers, and the families that have just gone through upheaval after upheaval. So while we were anticipating, given the economic upheaval on top of the COVID upheaval, while we were anticipating a really nightmarish budget, thankfully the new administration, the Biden administration, along with Congress, have really championed the most unprecedented stimulus package. It is the most unprecedented, and I always give people a bit of a sense of it. In the 2009 recession, the Obama administration, when they first came into office in 2009, did at that time what was considered one of the biggest stimulus packages ever, and that was $900 million. That package was exceeded last year with a whole host of additions, other stimulus packages. But in addition, we this year, well, last week, I guess, they passed the $1.9 trillion package, and none of that goes to, well, very little of that goes to tax credits. Half of the Obama one, and by the way, this is not to disparage former President Obama by any stretch. It's just to give a sense of the magnitude here and the size. Um, but even that one, the 900 billion, if I said 900 million, I was incorrect. But the 900 billion that was passed at that time, uh, it- has paled in comparison. Plus, half of that went to tax cuts. So this is to say this is unprecedented is nothing short of extraordinary. And on top of that, as you know, we have also made some tough decisions after lots of advocacy on both sides of the issue. We have also made the decision to include in our one house budgets in the Senate and the Assembly. We are also taxing multimillionaires and billionaires. There's been a lot of controversy about that, but I think given what we have seen with the growth of income inequality in the state, which was really highlighted at the beginning of COVID, especially among those who were getting ill and those who did not. I think it was important that we ask those who have done well in many ways under COVID, financially better under COVID, to do more. So we do have a few multimillionaire taxes that were included in the bill. Since yesterday, the governor came out and said that they have found another $5 billion. So those debates are going to be ongoing over the next week or two. Sorry, by next week, we will have to reconcile those additions. But in the meantime, between that federal aid and between some of the tax revenue that we have raised through these new revenue streams, for the first time, I mean, we have a double-digit increase in education. Is expected to rise 12% over last year's spending. As you know, we would consider it a home run when we do about 3%. So this is just huge. And again, we think it is going to go a long way. Maybe, and I'm sorry if you already know a lot of this, but it is a 3-year commitment, front loaded mostly this year, to pay down the foundation aid. So it's a total amount of 29.5 billion, but the increase in foundation aid alone is the 1.4 billion. Again, with 60% of that going to foundation aid. We also include in the assembly package, we include $10 million for mental health. Personally, I think you have to look at mental health just across the curriculum, across everything. I think we're in just with the horrific shootings that we've seen around the country in the last few days. I think we are just barely beginning to touch the needs of mental health needs around the district, and I'd love to hear more. I know some very creative things are underway in the districts, in various school districts. So we've rejected a number of the governor's proposals, and again, you may know this, including the attempt yet again to consolidate the 11 expense-based aids. I mentioned the federal funds. I think you all know, and I know I had texted your superintendent that just from that aid alone, you're getting an additional 2.5 million. And my understanding is there's supposed to be some flexibility that you can roll that out. One of the other significant pieces of this, of both the Assembly and the Senate versions of our one House bills, is that we add in 75 million more for pre-K. The Senate is adding in 500 million for pre-K. It is targeted at districts that are starting up. So if there is an interest, there are increased funds for that. We've added in a lot more on child care. These are the kind of things that get balanced out. We've put in a lot, hundreds of millions more in child care. The Senate chose to put it in pre-K. I think it's all good, and I think the more we can do a pre-K, the better. So let me mention another small piece that might not have been in any of your summaries of this, but we do have in the Assembly version, we do increase the ability to carry over fund balance. And I've just looked at this today. I think we have 6%. The Senate has 8%, and they give more years. I think we give 3 years of an increased fund balance to carry over the 6%, and the Senate is 8% over 5 years. Happy to take questions on that. I know that that is an ongoing concern. I was just talking to our Ways and Means person about that yesterday, actually, to make sure that we do give some flexibility. I know it's something the governor's office has not supported in the past, partly because they wanted all dollars on the street, if you will. But I think there's a very good case to be made. I also asked if the federal aid would be tied to either of those percentages, or would the federal aid be exempt from those fund balance limits of the, again, whether it ends up at 6 or 8%. Um, as of yesterday, they were still negotiating that. So that remains an open item, as do a number of these things. And I should also add that I'm on the Education Conference Committee, where these things get negotiated between the Assembly and the Senate. So so it gives me yet another entree to go back at these couple of at the two different bills. And then I just I think that's it for the highlights, but I am happy to take questions. I just want to add that I ended up meeting with the Bethlehem School Board yesterday, and we ended up in a whole discussion about remote learning and what they're seeing and what they're looking at. And I gave them kudos, and I want to give you huge kudos. I know from going back and forth with your superintendent and others that you went through extraordinary lengths to keep your schools open as much as reasonably possible. I know there were times everybody had to quarantine or shut down, but I just want to commend you for all the efforts. And I know what teamwork that took. I know that those were agonizing decisions for staff, for teachers, for families, and even for the students themselves. The fear that these students have been through with this pandemic, I think, is something we're going to be grappling with for many years. But I just want to commend. I would still like to see more of our schools open. As you know, a number of our upstate urban schools are not open at the middle and high school level, and while there are trade-offs to both sides, I am pleased that the CDC is now recommending the 3-foot rule, although there are still a few hoops to jump through there, and we're still waiting on DOH guidance, but hopefully that will make things a little easier for your district. But I just can't say enough how much I admire the efforts that you went through to keep your students engaged and to keep the classrooms open as much as feasible, or as much as humanly possible, and yet of course keep everybody as safe as possible. So big kudos, and I probably should have started that with that, but I want to end with that. And I really welcome, I know there's more. I'm just trying to give you the overall picture here, and hope that helps.
Who has questions for Pat? Judy? Don't, you need to unmute. There you go.
Yep. I just want to make sure, Ms. Fahey, that with this, we're not giving with one hand and taking away with the other, or moving the budget so that it ends up not being the 2.5 million. This is totally separate.
Yes, you know what? It just probably a half hour ago, I got literally a photo and a text of what Senator Schumer said out in Utica. How about I read that to you, because I think it will give you a sense of it. I think partly because of New York, the federal legislation was written that money go directly to municipalities, the money for localities, as well as to school districts. So let me read you a quote from, it must have been an event today that Senator Schumer was at. And this is quote from Senator Schumer: "When you give the money to Albany, they never see it." Quote unquote, from Senator Schumer when explaining the direct aid to local governments. But the same can be said for the schools. And I'm not trying to be tongue in cheek here or be humorous, but I know that there was tremendous frustration over some of those withholds, and I I want to be fair here. I think some of the withholding was we were in the most of unprecedented times. And I think there was an effort to try to manage as wisely as possible. We certainly didn't know who was going to be elected president in November. We certainly saw prolonged fights over previous stimulus packages. So I don't want to be too tongue in cheek here. While I was one who even held press events to try to get that money to the school districts last fall, uh, I I do recognize that there were some efforts because we didn't know what we were facing. That said, uh, I know I was one who advocated with Schumer's office, as well as Gillibrand, to really help make the case that the money needed to go directly to the districts and the localities. So I think we've been heard loud and clear, and I think it really ended up influencing national legislation. So my understanding is all 2.5 million of that goes right to the district. There is a 20%, I forget the word they're using. Marie may know that. I don't want to say withhold, but a 20%, like a set aside to really encourage a targeting at those who have lost, for those who have lost learning. In other words, those to encourage summer programs, to encourage after school programs, or do what you need to do to bring up those who have fallen behind in the last year. But the way I understand it is that 20% of the 2.5 million is flexible. Superintendent, please correct me if I didn't articulate that correctly.
We haven't seen a ton of written guidance yet, but that is my understanding to this point too.
Okay, good. That is my understanding, and I've been in we initially got incorrect funding formulas, and it's and thankfully I didn't share them widely. I was given them by Senator Schumer's office, and I sent them to our Ways and Means person, and I said, this just doesn't sound right. It was stunningly generous. It's already generous, but it just seemed off. And sure enough, the Congressional Research Service had done the initial formula runs incorrectly. So these ones we're told we can kind of take to the bank. That my understanding is they are supposed to be correct, and they did catch they had miscalculated New York City of all school districts to miscalculate, and it threw off everything. So my understanding is those numbers are pretty solid, but we'll be happy to confirm all that. But the only thing is the 20% is intended to really go at those who have lost. I don't have the term in front of me, but the lost learning, something about lost learning, but it's very flexible. And I think creative spending is encouraged on that. I understand some school districts are looking at even evening classes, things of that nature.
Pat, I think we have a question from Barbara Frederico.
Sure.
I don't know if this is a question, Pat, for you or for Neil or for Marie, but a number of people have said that they were still interested in remote learning. And I know our school district is pretty large, and we've done some of that this year. Um, Even though it wouldn't be like a Westmere third grade class, it would be a Guilderland town class of third graders. But some of your rural districts don't have as great a population as we do, and yet there might still be a need for them to have remote learning, for certain situations. Is this something that would have to be run through a BOCES, or could there be mutual agreements between, say, Dwaynesburg and Guilderland, or one of the smaller towns?
Barbara, that is such an excellent question, and we ended up on in a whole conversation on that yesterday with Bethlehem. And Bethlehem, in my view, is a very comparable school district to yours. Both extraordinarily high performing, and I'm so proud to represent you. But we talked about their fear was, and they asked, where did I think things were going for the fall? And again, we don't know what's going to happen with these new variants. My hope is kids get in school, yesterday, right? We want these children back. I meet parent after parent. As you know, there was a protest of Albany school parents downtown yesterday. because their children have been home all year, and it is taking a very serious toll on middle school and high school children. So for the fall, I know some districts are saying they will still offer some remote learning. Bethlehem is concerned that if we don't make something mandatory, or if we don't put some criteria around it, the trends that they are seeing, and I've asked for them to keep me posted, and I'm actually going to reach out. It's funny you've mentioned BOCES because they're on my call list to reach out to. What they are seeing, and these were, there is no study here, but it's just trying to look at some of the trends, right? And they've said the students that are still going remote in their district are often the same students that, and I don't want to overstate this because again, this is all preliminary, but they've said it's often students who are also had poor attendance records pre-COVID. So their interest is in if there is an allowance for remote learning, full-time remote learning. I mean, I think what you said, Barbara, would include some type of hybrid. But there is a concern that maybe it be somehow add some criteria to make sure that there is good attendance or participation in some way or another. Because I may have mentioned I mentor a refugee family, and a second son of mine who graduated a number of years ago now from Albany, but his younger brother is still at Albany, and I don't want to name names, but he said he doesn't want to go back. And I think some of that is just you get in a comfort zone, and even if it's not um, the best academically for the student, I think they, a lot of kids have gotten used to just laying in their beds and working remotely. And we've all read the stories of the students that are thriving, students who may have felt bullied or felt, ostracized or whatever the case may be. We've read the stories of children thriving, but the early studies are showing the remote working is definitely subpar. So we're going to have to, that's a long answer, Barbara, to say, I think these are really good questions. We're going to need some data on it. And we spoke about BOCES yesterday. I really, but that it stuck with me. That is that a trend we're going to see, that those who are choosing to stay remote, was there a attendance issue prior to that? How are they doing academically compared to what they did pre-COVID? So I think there's just a number of criteria we're going to have to look at. So that's the um um that's the one probably concerned side of me. The other side of me, I'm also reading a number of articles about saying, we could see some permanent changes across education, across the country, if not the world. And some of the ability for, as you said, a rural student to now get that Chinese 2 class or Chinese 4 class or a photography class that they might not have had if they were in a really small school district, that they might have more options to get now. So I think there's, we want to take some of the positives from this while we're also addressing, those who are falling through the cracks. So there's a lot to be addressed. We also have to address vaccines. I welcome your input on vaccines. As you know, there's already pending legislation about vaccines for students. We haven't started vaccinating children. We're still waiting on the studies, but it didn't stop some of my colleagues from already introducing bills on that. So welcome your input on that. Can I ask on the vaccines, what % of your staff or staff and teachers are vaccinated at this point?
Pat, we have not surveyed in the way that some of our neighbors have. Anecdotally, I can tell you that many, many, many are already with their first dose and also with their second, but I can't give you a percentage. I don't know, Regan, if you have a better ballpark. We just didn't do that survey, and so we're not entirely sure.
Okay. I mean, again, those are the things I'm curious about. I'm curious. I really am going to ask BOCES to kind of do a little bit of research, because I think it is going to help inform us. And, we want to At this point, I think even if all schools open tomorrow, we still need to give parents those options. I think all parents should have a choice as to whether to go hybrid or remote or full time. I think that part is important, but we also want to make sure we're drilling down to make sure that we're doing what's in the best interest of the children. So I hope that answers your question, Barbara. Sorry to digress a little.
Any other questions for Pat? Blanca?
Thank you, Ms. Fee. This is actually more of a comment. I just hope that, can you hear me okay?
I can now. Yeah.
That when you're making these decisions and when looking at this, that we don't focus on the generalizations of, absenteeism and things like that, because really this remote learning has been great for some kids. It's true that most children benefit from going in person, but there really have been some success stories in our own district. There are 2 board members here, myself included, who have children that are thriving on remote learning. And so I would really like to see it stick around. I think that this is the opportunity for a new beginning. And also, as a public health professional, I think we need to have that option, because even if we get to a point where all the pediatrics are being vaccinated and all of our teachers can get vaccinated, not every single person will be able to get a vaccine. They won't be physically capable. So we need to have an option who come from households where not everybody can get vaccinated, or they themselves can't get vaccinated. So I really feel like that has to be an option that stays.
Yeah.
Thank
Again, as I said, I think we're going to need to look at some criteria when we pass state laws, as you know, has to apply across the state, right? And I do think there's been enough anecdotal information that remote learning is working for some. By and large, the studies are showing it is not. It is subpar. And that's to I'm not trying to overgeneralize. I'm just going with the studies that I've seen. And as you know, they're estimating nationally that there are 3 million students that are unaccounted for, are the estimates. So, so what's working, the student I referred to is not thriving by any stretch of the imagination. And um, listened to the Albany School Board parent comments, and 10 plus parents got up saying how their elementary school child is thriving and their middle or high school child is not. So it really, some of this is child dependent, some of this is the type of support at home. I would like to think that if we move one way or another, that we do have some criteria. That, in other words, if the child is not participating, if they're not attending, there has to be some other type of intervention than just to say, okay, you can stay going remote while failing. As I said, all those are very, very preliminary discussions. And the positive side of this is, you are right. We're going to continue to see some form of remote options, I think, going forward. I mean, first of all, we've just spent a lot of money equipping a lot of school districts, and we're about to spend a lot more to equip them, as well as families. And where this allows for, again, a photography course, a world geography, or courses that not every small school district can offer, we want to take advantage of the positive parts of this. We really do. So I think more to come. And then on the vaccines, that was one of the ugliest votes we took a couple of years ago, was the mandatory vaccines for school children. I had over the last year a very seriously medically compromised child myself, who could not have been vaccinated up until a week and a half ago. So I more than understand that there are medically fragile, medically compromised children, and I think we are always going to have to add that exemption. And by the way, it's the same for teachers and staff. We have medically compromised, medically fragile individuals, and I'm afraid I had a up close and personal experience with it myself over the last year. So I hear you. We're going to have to look at all of that, and that's why. Again, maybe I was being a little bit tongue in cheek, but as I said, I have a colleague that's already introduced a bill, but that's going to need a little time in terms of vaccinations.
Pat, we've got two more questions. We'll have to do them kind of quickly because
Of course, yes, of course.
we have a long road ahead of us here tonight. Luciano, you're next, and then Barbara.
All right. Well, first, thank you, Ms. Fahey, for coming to our meeting and to speaking us directly. We really appreciate it. So my question is about the tax cap calculation. So this year, one aspect of the budget that was particularly difficult was this formula that's used. Is there any talk in the assembly to modify that formula or perhaps set a prescribed rate for future years?
For the funding formula overall, is that your question?
No, so for the tax cap calculation for districts to use, it's typically around 2%. This year was much lower. It was closer to 1.
Yes, okay, sorry, the tax cap. That is a debate every year. Like, in fact, a rather wicked debate. This year it's a little bit quieter because of all of the new increases, but that is a debate where we have pleaded, begged, just done sign-on letters, done everything possible to try to get some flexibility in that tax cap, such as adding in some exemptions on some capital projects or whatever the case may be. We have had zero success on that previously. Because there's at least increased funds this year, I would just to be honest, we have not had the prolonged debates about it that we've had in the past. But I think we will continue to have that. We did at the very beginning. A number of us weighed in saying we still need flexibility here because it really has not been fair. Again, because of the new increases, some of that pressure has come off. But I am happy to continue to talk to you about that. I do think. Well, I think voters in general support that because, especially upstate where we have very high property taxes, I think the voters in general like it until it comes to their individual school system and they see the hardship that it has created. So my guess is we'll go more back at that next year when presumably the money won't be flowing quite as much as it is right now. Although let's hope the economy is back and we'll see revenues flowing. So,
do we have time for one more quick one from Barbara?
This will be a quick one, I hope. One of the main problems that I've heard from teachers with the remote learning is the fact that kids do not leave their cameras on. They have no idea if the child is participating or not. And, they've been told, well, there's a privacy factor. Well, is there something that the state can do? I mean, there's got to be a nook or a cranny in every home or situation where the child can set up his laptop and participate, because that has been a real drawback, the fact that there isn't a give and take between the student and the teacher, and there doesn't seem to be anything that the teacher can do about it. So if we do go with this remote learning next year, for those who need it, or as Blanca noticed, some of the kids, believe it or not, are actually thriving under the system. Is there anything that the state can do to require the student, if you're going to be remote, you have to participate, you have to have your camera on, you have to have an interchange with your teacher?
Barbara, again, they're good and they're very tough questions. I've read of this, I've heard of it repeatedly. It's put the teachers in a very difficult position with trying to again, get children who are not as engaged or families who aren't as engaged to really try to go that extra mile to get those cameras on. Some school districts, I've heard comments about CBA where the students have to be in uniform and they have to be sitting at such and such time and the camera has to be on from, I think it's 8 a.m. on. So some school districts have been very, very strict about it, but of course that's a private school. So it's very different, but I think that you've just raised yet another issue of a problem that has come up repeatedly. It really is just coming up, and we have, as you know, all that's been left up to the local school districts. I do think teachers and administrators have done yeoman's work on this. But when you have a child who is disengaged or put off for whatever reason and choosing not to participate, we're just going to have to tackle this by next fall. And I think if the rates don't come down dramatically with all the vaccinations, I think the less we're on top of the COVID, on top of the pandemic, the more likely it is you will see more flexibility. If we're on top of it and really past this, the president is saying by the end of May, everybody, that wants a vaccination should have one. So in the next couple of months, I think there'll be a lot more clarity on these issues, and then we can address how flexible to be on those. But the cameras not being on is a serious problem. Sorry, I went on too long. Superintendent, I just want to say thank you for accommodating me so last minute. We always hesitate in March whether to reach out or not reach out, and I really appreciate this opportunity. Happy to come back at any time. Happy to do just meet with any of you in any way that we can. I so appreciate, especially the board members who are volunteers. I always feel I need to say that you give of your time and energy freely, and I want you to know how recognized that is.
Thank you, Pat, so much for, finding time to spend some time with us and sharing your insights and answering some of the most difficult questions on our horizon right now.
Yeah, and please keep us posted with the trends. Keep us posted with, as we make some of these decisions, or some we just may leave up to SED and the governor's office. It's some of that gets, it's not sure how much we will address all of these issues, right? Or whether we will try to legislate them. But I really do welcome a chance to continue to have these discussions, because none of these are easy answers.
Well, thanks so much for your work too, Pat. We know it's thankless, long, especially this time of year.
Yes.
Now you can go inside of your house and maybe get some dinner, right?
Yes. Yeah. Well, and if you saw my emails, it's back to work. But thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Pat. Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye now. Thank you.
All right. Are we ready for part 2? I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started on the presentation. All right. Well, let's get started. So let's begin with the title, which is about looking forward. We are looking forward in all senses of the word to a new school year after a really difficult end to the 1920 school year and the 2021 school year, which has been essentially straight uphill. And you all know about that. So we are truly looking forward to the new school year. And what we'll share tonight is, this is, remember, the first draft of our budget for 21-22. More to come, but we need to start somewhere. So here is kind of the sections of the PowerPoint that we'll share with you tonight. In typical fashion, I'm going to get us started. Neil will do the middle, and I'll do the last section. And then there'll be a chance for questions from the Board of Education before we wrap up. But we want to start with kind of an overview of our priorities for next year in the budget development process. Neil will talk about the financial context for budget development. We heard some of that from Pat Fahey. And then there will be a summary of recommended proposals for next year. You'll be happy to know there are very few of those. This is a budget about sustaining what we have. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps, and then we'll take your questions and answers. So here are some of those key questions, and I know everyone really wants to know, so what will school look like in 21-22? And while we don't have any answers that are big, that we can carve in stone, we can presume and project, and that's what we're going to do tonight. As always, when we're presenting a budget, what we're trying to do is reflect the priorities of our community, and we'll talk more about that. Equally important is our handle on what do our students need. And we have to recognize that when our students return in the fall, we're probably going to learn more about their needs than we know right now. And then, of course, the difficult part of this is what can we afford? And even more important is what can we sustain? And I know there's a lot of talk about a lot of money coming to the ways of to the accounts of school districts, and we need to be really careful about how we use that to sustain our work over time. So those are some of the key questions. Of course, we'll start with our mission. I went back to the archives a little bit to get this picture of graduation. Kind of a bittersweet thing to see after what we've been through and still what we're trying to figure out for June and our graduates of the 21, our graduates for 21. So just a little vision of hope. I'll remind you of our mission. And again, I've summarized it down to 4 words many, many times, but we're here for all kids, every last one of them. And we want them to be ready for whatever comes next. And both parts of that mission are a tall order if you want to do it really well. So our mission really is about all students. And our vision is really how we create this safe and welcoming environment seems to mean more than ever these days, where we can work together to serve our children well. So let me start with a brief summary of priorities. You'll recall back in mid-January, we launched 3 thought exchanges, one to our parents, one to our faculty and staff, and another to our students. And those reports are still listed on our district website. But I went through and I pulled the top thoughts from each of those on topics related to our budget and programming and spending. And you see lots of consensus across the 3 groups. You see a lot about keeping low class sizes. You see the word mental health across all 3 categories. You see a lot about maintaining staffing and academic programming. Parents say offer as much in-person learning as possible, kind of harkening back to the conversation we just had. And then you see from our students, they really had some, I think, very insightful points to remind all of us about, a focus on mental health, really tuned into curriculum that's quote unquote real life, culturally responsive, more language. They're interested in their science labs, which are coming, thankfully. They've talked about changing the start and end times of the school day. These were our older students who are, as much as they like to sleep in, are not fans of the 10:10 to 4:20 school day. They're interested in better Wi-Fi, and they always remind us that they would like improved environment around them, our facilities. And then board members, you'll recall that you also had your chance to weigh in and looked at the results from those 3 large exchanges. And these are the top 5 from the exchange that the 9 of you did. And here they are, 1 to 5, the top 5 thoughts. That commitment to small class sizes, the importance of maintaining our sports and extracurricular clubs. That's been a big topic for us in recent weeks. Focus on student social and emotional health, which of course has been huge. The preservation of programming, and then the maintenance of staffing levels. So that's what we worked on in putting this budget together for you. So for that first big question, what will 21-22 look like? You see the big asterisk, a lot of asterisks in this presentation, because there are things that we still need guidance on from the Department of Health, from the State Education Department. So these are presumptions. They're presumptions based on emerging data and more information. We simply had to start somewhere for this budget. So here's where we began. And that's that all students will attend school all day, every day. Who would have thought that that would be like a big deal at some point in our life, but that is a starting point. That our grade 5 students and staff will actually go back to our elementary buildings. They've been up at Farnsworth this year. That our 8th grade students will actually go back to FMS, and the 100 wing of the high school will no longer be the satellite Farnsworth Middle School. And then we're going back to class sizes that have been previously established. These are more familiar from 2 years ago, but you can see them there. Those are the guidelines that we've used. Going on about what next year will look like, the length of the school day will return to quote unquote normal, whatever that might be, and we'll talk some more about that. Start times will be reset. I was on the phone earlier today with a colleague of mine who didn't realize that we had 5 different start times here in Guilderland, and thought, wow, that's crazy. And I said, yes, we don't necessarily want to replicate that. But we also, as we think ahead to next year, we would like to see our athletics, our music programs, our art, and our extracurricular activities be returned to pre-COVID-19 conditions. We're seeing some of that now, which is great. And I know our community is really appreciative that our athletes are competing, that our musicians are playing, that our singers are singing, that our theater production thespians are performing, and that's coming up right this weekend. So that's great. I do presume that we'll still see masks everywhere, especially if the social distancing distances become smaller. And then this last bullet is, I think we still need to be pretty much ready for anything. And we will, in fact, do that. Just a couple other points in terms of how we planned this year. Some of this is the same. We went back and looked at what kinds of decisions we made a year ago, how they played out this year. Most of them in unexpected ways, but still we went back. We did look at our student needs, and enrollment is always the first one of those, and Mr. Sanders will spend some time talking about that. But we also have been looking closely at student academic, social, and emotional support, knowing that all of those are hugely important for the well-being of our children. We are thinking about robust and varied opportunities for learning, both in and out of the classroom. And then the bottom line is we have to recognize that we're all coming back from 18 months of unprecedented experience, upheaval, uncertainty, social isolation, interrupted opportunities for everything, but in our world here, for learning and for engagement. And there's just no doubt that the pandemic has affected everyone, all in different ways, some perhaps more than others, but that's affected our students, our families, our community, our faculty, our staff, our administrators. Everyone was touched by this, and we want to be mindful of that. So overall, this budget maintains class sizes at the 1920 school year level. We've preserved all existing programs and services for children. We've preserved and expanded some social and emotional supports. We've maintained overall staffing levels to the 2019-20 level. We have made some reallocations of resources to reflect changing student needs and or shifts in enrollment. And then Luciano brought up the tax cap. We are not going over that. We do not exceed the tax levy limit. So when the voters look at the final version of this budget as presented, we'll need a 50% simple majority to pass it. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Sanders, who will give us some context on the budget side of things and the dollars and cents.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wiles. As Dr. Wiles mentioned, it's important to remember where we start from. This is a budget to budget activity, so we want to look back at our starting point, which is the budget for this year, and then base all of our decisions going forward on that for next year. So as a reminder, for the 2020-21 budget process, 9.5 months in now, we did have a approved budget back on June 9th. Typically it's in May, but as you recall, the vote date was moved. It was totally by absentee ballot, by mail-in ballot. We had a budget at that time proposed of just over 103 million. We had a very high turnout, almost a record turnout. So yes votes, 4,906. That was 66% that voted yes. No votes, 2,524. That was 34%. So a great turnout. We had great results. We passed the budget. The budget increase for this current year is 0.91%. Our estimated tax rate increase was 2.25%. And just some quick data about our school district. Our enrollment in the current year, 4,824 students. Employee data, we have 710 full-time and 222 part-time for a total of 932. And if we were just to look at that breakdown a little bit differently in our staff, number of teachers is 498, our support staff is 407, and then we have a total of 27 administrators and supervisors. Next, we'll look at our enrollment data for the current year, as well as our projections for next year. So at the elementary, we have 2,204 students in the current year. We're projecting a small growth to 2,243. That's 39 students overall. At the middle school, it's relatively flat. We're only going up 3 students in grades 6 through 8. And then at the high school, there is a drop there, projecting a reduction of about 56 students, a little more substantial at the high school level. Overall, pretty close. We were down 14 students from the current year going into next year. So one of the things we always want to look at are what are some of the major factors that are influencing the budget for next school year. First, we'll talk a little bit about revenues, local revenues, and things like interest earnings. We do rent classrooms to BoCs. We do get money for students in foster care reimbursement. So those are the 3 big factors that comprise the $401,000 loss in revenue that we're anticipating from next year. So as you know, interest rates are down and have dropped significantly since the start of the pandemic. Our earnings is very limited to begin with in terms of safe types of earning investments that we have to participate in. Interest rate drop has contributed quite a bit to that. In terms of classroom rental, BoCES has informed us they need 1 less classroom next year to rent. So that's another portion of this. And then we also have a reduction in the number of foster students. It varies from year to year, and our projection right now is that it's going to drop and we won't be getting the amount of revenue that we typically get. In terms of state aid, and Assemblymember Pat Fahey talked about this. We'll talk about this a little bit more in detail as well. But right now, budget to budget, foundation aid and per pupil formula aids, we're projecting to go down about $41,000. And then in terms of our expense-based aids, we're looking at an increase of about $668,000. Federal aid, an increase of about $351,000. On the other side, though, we've had to apply more in terms of our savings, our fund balance and reserves to help balance out the budget. And we'll talk a little bit about why we need to do that. But we do have to go into our savings a little bit to help balance out the expenditure side of the budget. And that's about $350,000 additional that we'll need to apply. In terms of expenditures, some of the major factors there, our debt payments have increased about $156,000. We're embarking on a capital project, or we have embarked on a capital project. So we've gone out for 1 borrowing, a bond anticipation note. We'll be going out for further borrowing, but that's the initial debt payment tied to that. Health insurance is up $415,000 for next year. Our retirement system contributions for both the employees' retirement system and teachers' retirement system are projected to go up $455,000. In terms of some decreases, charter school tuition, we're expecting a reduction there of about 9 students, so it equates to about $109,000. We expected a bubble. It didn't arrive in the current year, and we don't see that arriving next year either. So coming off the bubble there a little bit in terms of our projection. In terms of special education placements, both BoCES and privates, we're looking at an overall decline in the number of students attending, which equates to a reduction of about $164,000. And then in terms of teacher salary savings, we have 18 retirements coming into next year. That equates to about $754,000. So significant salary breakage is what we call it when we're replacing a more senior teacher who's been here a long time and is more at the top of the pay scale, with somebody new coming in. Again, you have to say tremendous professional loss for the school district, so we're not anxious to see all of these teachers leave, but certainly they've contributed greatly to our school district over the years. We wish them well, and as a result, there will be some savings as we replace those teachers as they go into retirement. And finally, in terms of our tax levy, one of the things and Luciano brought this up earlier in the meeting, one of the things we're looking at is what's that CPI factor in the formula, the allowable growth factor. For the coming school year, it's going to be 1.23%, so it's well below the 2% maximum. If it were at the 2% maximum, the difference would be about $568,000. So it's significant in terms of how much smaller that allowable growth factor or CPI percentage factors, what a difference that makes when it's smaller as opposed to being at the maximum of 2%. So I'll talk a little bit about the executive budget proposal. Again, Assemblymember Fahey covered a lot of ground here, so I'll go through it rather quickly and not try to spend too much time on topics she covered. Overall, the executive budget proposal assumed $6 billion in new state funding from the federal government, and that is the new American Rescue Plan Act. Overall increase in school aid that was proposed in this executive budget was $2.1 billion. There was an allocation of $3.8 billion in federal Corona Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, and that was the stimulus funds from December 27, 2020, otherwise known as the CARES 2 package. Also included was a new local district funding adjustment. That was a reduction in state aid to schools by $1.35 billion. And then there was also this provision that was proposed by the governor to reduce expense-based aids and turn them into a block services aid grant that was reduced by nearly $400 million. And this is the second year this was proposed. It was proposed for the current year, did not come to fruition, but is on the table again with this current executive budget proposal. And both of those reductions I just mentioned would be offset by CARES Act or Coronavirus Act funding. So to look at some numbers and how that plays out with the executive budget proposal, see the categories of aid on the left on the chart. We have our budget next to that for the current school year. Then what I've done is identified what the budget proposal is from the governor with the services aid reduction included and then without it. And this is the topic of debate within the state right now. Senate and Assembly about whether that services aid would be included or not. Ms. Fahey indicated that she didn't think it would be part of it anymore, but that hasn't been adopted yet, so it's still on the table, and to see the differences on how that might play out. So basically, in the current year, we're getting about $25.2 million. If we look at the middle column, you can see how all of those aid components in the current year are identified between foundation aid, BOCES aid, software, library, textbook, hardware, technology, transportation. Those are the categories that comprise that upper half. Foundation aid was maintained at the current level, but those next group of what we call expenditure-based aids, we get aid back on the amount that we spend. The idea in the current year is there's an aid ratio attached to each of them, depending on how much you spend, and the aid ratio will determine how much in dollars you get back in state aid. When it's combined together in this category called services aid, everything kind of loses its identity and its own funding formula, becomes a lump sum, and the whole idea behind that was once it's in a lump sum, it's very hard to parse out where the increases are coming from or decreases in need, and it's easier to control increases at the state level. So we weren't in favor of the proposal, but it is on the table. So you can see proposal would be $5.75 million with that services aid component. The only thing outside of that are two categories of aid, which is excess costs, which is for students with disabilities, and building aid. If it's without the services aid and we take that same formula and run it, we're back to using the numbers again, and you can see the difference budget to budget as we're looking at the differences in terms of our overall expenditures and how that may play out with the formulas. So again, if we look at that upper section for total state aid, 25.169 with the services aid component. Without it, it jumps up to 25.5 million. Down at the bottom is the federal aid component. So typically we only have Medicaid reimbursement in that category. What's been added is the supplemental stimulus COVID aid. That was added in by the governor, and then adjustment was taken back out of that, an offset, if you will. It's called a local funding adjustment, so we don't get the full value of that. The state was taking back a portion of it. So that's the same in both of those instances. So overall, if we look at this, we would be looking at if the services aid bundling went into effect, year-to-year increase from a budget standpoint, it's just over $600,000. If the formulas were allowed to run and based on actual expenditures, that would increase to $978,000 increase overall. I'll walk through some of the Assembly and Senate budget proposals. Again, these were referred to by Pat Fahey. Both the Senate and Assembly reject the executive proposals that hold foundation aid flat, and that would be for the second consecutive year, to consolidate those expense-based aids that I just discussed into that services aid block grant, and to also create this local district funding adjustment. It's a state aid reduction. So they're rejecting all three of those components as proposed in the executive budget proposal. However, what they did counter propose with is a foundation increase of $1.4 billion for the state, which would also include a minimum of a 2% per district increase. So every district in the state would receive at least a 2% increase. That every district would receive at least 60% of their Formula 8 amount. Again, that was touched on by Mrs. Fahey. And a 3-year phase-in to ensure all districts are fully funded by the 2023-24 school year, which again was mentioned by Mrs. Fahey. So the idea is that foundation aid, which had elapsed and fallen behind in terms of its intended increases, would be fully funded in just a few years. Also, as she mentioned, providing that fund balance flexibility is currently at 4% in terms of an overall cap that schools are allowed to keep. But the two proposals is either to increase that to 6% or 8%, depending on whether it's the Assembly proposal or the Senate proposal. Again, that gives districts a lot more flexibility in terms of managing their finances and having something to draw from in the event there is a reduction in state aid or economic distress in future years. In terms of the most recent American Rescue Plan Act that was passed by Congress, we haven't received anything official on this yet in terms of what this actually means for us, but there are a lot of organizations that are out there that are looking at this and have compiled information. So what I'll be talking about is really a read and synopsis of that information that's out there about what we might expect with this new act for school districts. So New York State is slated to receive $23 billion overall. That's $12.5 billion that's in direct aid for state purposes. $9 billion, though, was allocated for K-12 education. So a significant amount of that is targeted for K-12. Those funds are available and can be used for K-12 education through December 31st, 2024. So there is some time, a few years that we have to be able to utilize this money. We don't have to use it all in one shot. And all right at the beginning, we can spread that out over time and use it as we need to and as circumstances dictate. Just a reminder, when the executive budget proposal was created, the whole plan was developed around New York State itself receiving $6 billion in direct aid. So they've more than doubled the amount that they expect to receive under the current plan. Guilderland allocation, as was mentioned, is $2.5 million, and also as Pat Fahey mentioned, part of the stipulation around the act is that we're required to use 20% of that total to address lost learning time. So that is a key component of the overall plan. In terms of the overall federal investment in K-12 education since the pandemic has started, so these are the measures that Congress has passed. The initial one was the CARES Act right at the beginning of the pandemic, early on, 13.2 billion. Then after that came the Corona Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, and that was in December. That was 54.3 billion. The most recent one is the American Rescue Plan Act. There's two components to that. One is an E-rate component. That's 7.2 billion. And that is some funding for schools as well through that process. Also directly to K-12 education, 125.4 billion. So total federal funding through all of these stimulus packages since the pandemic started, 200.1 billion. So to talk a little bit more about the K-12 education funding piece, out of that 125.4 billion, how does that break down? Public school funding, direct public school funding is 122 billion. There's a component that's targeted for school-age children with disabilities. That's at 2.6 billion of that total. And also, finally, educational services for homeless students at 0.8 billion. In terms of that $122 billion public school funding allocation, again, there's some breakdowns there. So the school district distribution, and it's based on Title I allocation, was how it was distributed to schools across the country. That totals 109.8 billion. The lost learning time targeted at 6.1 billion, based in the requirements to use evidence-based interventions. Another 1.2 billion has been allocated for after-school programs. 1.2 billion again for summer enrichment programs. And then there's the remaining 3.7 billion goes to states, and they can use that for any remaining state needs and administration costs. So what can this money be used for under the American Rescue Plan Act? As we mentioned, addressing learning loss is a key component, student mental health supports, after school and summer learning programs, also hardware and software for remote and hybrid learning, for purchasing protective equipment, PPE, cleaning, disinfecting, and training, air quality and ventilation improvements, improving preparedness efforts, and planning for school closures. There's a few more, but those are the larger items in that list of the allowable uses for the funding. Now we'll go back to our budget and the tax levy limit or property tax cap formula. So again, as you know, in New York State, they adopted a property tax cap formula some time ago. It's an 8-step formula. It was made up by New York State. It's the same formula all school districts have to use. The formula does limit the increase in the vast majority of expenses. There are some exclusions, but very few, to 1.23%, and that was based on the CPI. And that's the factor that every school district will have to use for the 2021-22 school year. The result of that formula determines the amount that property taxes can increase. So it really sets a threshold for voter approval. And that's really what the whole formula is designed to do, is come up with the threshold amount for voter approval. So once we set that or identify that threshold amount, if the tax increase is less than or equal to the threshold amount, we just need 50% of the voters to vote yes to get a passed budget. But if we propose a tax increase that's greater than that threshold amount, we have to have a supermajority of 60% of the voters voting yes to have a passed budget. If a budget's ultimately defeated, no increase in the tax levy is permitted. And that would have to be twice. The board could elect under a defeated budget to put it up again. If it's defeated a second time, there is no other choice. You would have to go to a contingent budget, and then you could have no increase in the tax levy. So to take a look at our tax levy limit calculation here in Guilderland, we would start out with our prior year tax levy, which is 74.99 million. There's a tax-based growth factor. It's what's called a bricks and mortar factor. So it's actually new construction. So it's not residential or commercial property improvements. It's a factor supplied by the state, which reflects growth of new construction. It's a positive amount for us, 1.0043. That gets us to our subtotal of an adjusted prior year tax levy, 75.3 million. That tax-based growth factor adds about $322,000 to our tax levy subtotal. And then what we do is we add in our prior year pilot agreements, payment in lieu of taxes agreements, 74,000. Then we take away our capital expenditures. These are improvements in our buildings that we're paying debt on, net of state aid. So that's the 1.5 million that you see there. That brings us to what's called an adjusted prior year tax levy of 73.8 million. Now comes the CPI factor. Again, it's a maximum of 2%. If it's less than 2%, you take the lesser, but you can never have no more than 2%. Since the CPI was lower than 2% this year, it's the 1.23%. Applying that growth factor, that gets you to your growth adjusted tax levy subtotal of 74.7 million. So at this point, overall, the tax levy is up 908,000. Take away next year's payment in lieu of taxes of $48,000. And then that brings us to what's truly called the tax levy limit at 74.7, but then we get to add back capital expenditures net of state aid for the coming year, 1.2 million. That brings us to our total maximum allowable tax levy amount, 75,953,398. That's a $962,403 increase, or 1.28%. In terms of our overall projected budget for next year, we're looking at an increase of $1,862,875. That brings our total budget to $104,895,570. That's a 1.18% increase, and an estimated tax impact of 1.28%. We always like to show a graph of how our the expenditure budget is appropriated among the various categories of expense. Again, we're a people industry. We teach children. We need adults to do that. We have a lot of staff that needs to be there to assist children in learning and growth. Largely, most of our budget is spent on salaries and benefits for all of those staff to be able to teach children. Next in line is contracted services at 7%. We have BoE services comprising 5.7% of the budget. Debt service is 4.9%. Equipment and supplies are 2.2% of the overall budget. And finally, we have a small portion for what's called interfund transfers at 0.3%. In terms of the larger expenditure categories, we can look at the change from year to year. So professional salaries, this is teachers, administrators, teaching assistants, an increase of 599,000. Support staff salaries are up 389,000. Employee benefits projected to grow up by 943,000. Small reduction in equipment of over $20,000. Supplies and textbooks increasing about $13,000. Reduction in contractual services of about $232,000. Small increase in BoE services of $15,000. Increase in debt service of $156,000. And those are the major elements comprising that $1.8 million increase. In terms of the revenue budget, local sources, talked about that briefly before, looking at a rather substantial reduction there of $401,000. State and federal aid increasing by $978,000. Again, use of our savings, an additional amount from our savings, we need to do that to balance the budget. So we're taking $350,000 more. So as Pat Fahey discussed, the ability to keep more in fund balance would be helpful going forward, to provide a cushion to help us through difficult times. So we are using a little bit of that surplus to balance the budget this year. And then finally, property taxes increasing by $935,000. And just to touch base quickly on fund balance and reserves, Again, this is our savings, and just like you in your personal life, you want to have some savings available for unforeseen circumstances, to have something you can draw on if you need to. School districts are no different. So we have fund balance and reserves. You can see in 13-14, we're just under 6 million. Over the 5-year period, we're able to get that up to about 14 million, which on a $100 million budget is not unduly large. But when we built that up, we also, in 2018-19, took 3.15 million from a capital reserve we had at that time and put that toward our capital project, lowering our borrowing costs. That's the reduction in 2018-19. Built that back up very little in 2019-20. And then also, we've had this graph for several years to talk about where are we in terms of our fund balance as a percentage of revenue compared to our suburban council school counterparts. You can see we occupy spot number 1 in this graph. Spot number 1's not the best one. That means we have the lowest amount of savings available to us. So if there were a dire emergency and we needed to draw on our savings, we have the least amount of savings of any other suburban council school district. And you can see it ranges across all the way up to 31%. We're at 11%. The median, if you look at it, is probably somewhere close to about 18% for our neighboring school districts. So that's a point to remember as board members, that this is another piece of the financial equation we need to be careful of having adequate savings. There are a couple of residual benefits from this as well. When we have less savings, we have a reduced bond rating. So we get rated by Moody's. If our bond rating goes down, we pay more when we borrow money. So when we have a capital project, if our bond rating is low, we don't get as good a rate and we pay more interest costs over time. It's also a signal for the state of potential fiscal stress. The comptroller does an audit of this each year and identifies schools and municipalities that are approaching potential fiscal stress or identified as having fiscal stress. And really one of the requirements is how much do you have in a fund balance? If you don't have an adequate amount, you score lower and it puts you at greater risk of fiscal stress. So it's a signal or barometer of that. And then we have just overall less flexibility to work with. So if we have an economic downturn, how do we make things work? And sometimes you have to go to your savings to make things work for a short period of time. The savings aren't there, it really gives you no flexibility. So now we're talking about reducing services and staff and impacting the educational process for students. And then in terms of the tax levy limit law, where allowable is and where we are in relation to that. So in terms of our maximum allowable, we're right at the max. So we are rated our tax levy limit. That results in that increase of $962,000 or 1.28%. So again, at this point, we need 50% of the voters to vote yes. And we're still good. We haven't exceeded the maximum allowable tax levy limit. And then finally, for the financial component, I always like to share this slide to give people a reminder and the board a reminder of how the budget votes have gone over the last several years. So you can see we've gotten good support for our community over time, passing budgets by 2/3 or more margins. Despite varying numbers of voters, we've consistently done that. We've consistently had a relatively low tax levy increase in the 2% or less area. And the same, our tax levy limit has varied over time, but we have been within those tax levy limits in each of the years and have not brought forth a budget that has exceeded the tax levy limit. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Marie.
Thanks so much, Neil, for all that good information. So I'm going to transition now to talk about what we're looking for programmatically for next year based on the finances that Mr. Sanders just shared with you. So here are some of the recommendations for the new school year. And I'm going to start with elementary class sections. As I mentioned when we began, we're going to be using our existing class size guidelines in our enrollment projections that you saw at the beginning of this presentation to establish our sections. So K through 2, that's 18 through 23 students, and grades 3 through 5 is 21 to 25 students. So based on these guidelines, there is no overall change in the number of sections district-wide. But in the next chart, I'll show you there is movement between and among grades and buildings. But overall, we have the same number of sections. But I did want to address a comment that came up many, many times in the thought exchange about how much people really liked the class sizes of 14 that we had this year. And I know they were popular, but they are virtually impossible to sustain for a number of reasons. For one, the only way we had space for that many numbers of sections was to relocate students across the district. So 5th grade went to the middle school, 8th grade came to the high school, a whole wing of the high school was displaced, and our high school students came to school every other day. So that is one of the byproducts of having such small numbers of students in classes. And it resulted too in the hybrid teaching model for our secondary students, which I know it had its pluses and minuses, but it's tremendously challenging as an instructional delivery model for our secondary teachers to every single day have a group of students in front of them in their classroom and another group on the computer and another group who were only through the virtual. Just really, really difficult. And then a part that we maybe haven't talked about as much as we should have, but in order to staff all those additional sections, we redeployed people widely. So many of our teaching assistants became cohort teaching assistants. So they were no longer serving in that role, that supporting role within a classroom. They were leading a cohort of students. And our elementary teachers in every building except Linwood actually became departmentalized. And so we would have one teacher come through and work with the group on reading, and another in math, and another in science. So there was this constant transition of teachers while the students stayed put. The only reason we didn't do that at Linwood, by the way, in case you're wondering, is because at Linwood we have double classrooms. So we could open the divider between 2 classrooms and have space for regular size classes. And we could offer instruction very much looking like it would in a typical year, except in huge classroom spaces. We also redeployed reading teachers and some of our ENL teachers to be cohort teachers. And that impacted the ability for many of our students to receive additional intervention in those areas. So while it worked for the short term, it's not a long-term solution. So I know everyone loved the 14, but it was a pandemic response. Here's the chart we share each and every year. And, you know, I know it's a lot of information on a single slide, but what I've shown here is the sections where we have, based on enrollment and our guidelines, added or eliminated a section for a particular grade, and then the resulting average class size within that building. So for example, at Altamont, we've added a kindergarten, and for next year, the class size average will be 16.33. Wherever you see an asterisk, and there are 6 of them on here, in case you're counting, those are classrooms that as of today in our projections are very close to the upper guideline that I shared earlier. So you'll see at the bottom of the page, I said those are under review. And we are looking at those constantly. We're actually starting now to watch as new students enroll or students move away, what's happening to these numbers. We look at those sections for potential use of our unassigned FTEs, which I've noted at the bottom of the slide here as well. And usually by May, June, early July at the latest, if we see those numbers crossing over the upper guideline, we will consider creating a new section. And then at the far right, you see the overall average class size for grade levels across the district. And those are very competitive with our suburban council peers. We have very good class size ratios. So the other thing I'll point out, and I will mention this again, is that in the budget we've prepared for you this evening, we actually have a record number of unassigned FTEs. There's 5.7 built in this. Typically we have 3, 4, some years we've had 5. And I'll, in a couple slides here, talk with you a little bit about where we came up with the 5.7 and the reason behind it. I don't have a lot to say about middle school this evening. We're not making any changes there at all, not in numbers of sections, not in any programming. So I'm just sharing with you based on the movement of students from the current grade to the next grade, where we are projecting class sizes at the middle school. You can see it's based on 14 sections in each of the 3 grades. And then you can see the resulting class size averages for each of the grades. And now I'm going to transition to the high school. Mr. Sanders pointed out way back in the earlier slides our enrollment for our elementary buildings, middle and high. And you are seeing and will continue to see a decline in enrollment in the high school. We're at 1,463 students for next year. That's well below 1,500. And over the next couple years, it's going to get even lower. I think like as low as 1,411 is the lowest in the projection. It's in your appendices. So when we have declining enrollment, we have fewer students, and that means we have the need for fewer sections of courses, and that results in some reductions. So Mike Piscatelli and his team now have all of the student requests for courses for next year. So this is based on actual numbers of actual students who have signed up for courses for 21-22. And these are the reductions in staff that he's projecting at this time. So it's a 0.5 in social studies and math each, 0.3 in science, a 0.2 in music, a 0.1 in PE, and a 0.1 in art. So in that rationale impact statement, these are all based on declines of enrollment and reduced number of sections. This isn't elimination of electives. It's not overcrowding classrooms. It's simply a function of fewer students. But what I'm proposing is that we do not actually eliminate those FTEs from the budget, but rather, given the uncertainty of the coming year, that we transition them to the pool of unassigned FTEs. So we had originally planned 4 unassigned FTEs to present to you tonight, but are really coming forward with 5.7, which is the total of these reductions at the high school. That's a total of 1.7. So we'll be interested in your thoughts on that, but we feel, given the uncertainty that is still out there, we would like to have as much flexibility as possible when our students return in the fall. The other high school related topic I want to bring to your attention is our assistant principal vacancy. As you all know, our amazing Amy Horalchuk has moved on to a great opportunity to be the head of school, the principal, chief academic officer. They have fancy titles over at Tech Valley High School, and they are so fortunate to have her, but it creates a hole for us here in Guilderland. So what we would like to do is to think about this position a little bit differently, to restructure it, but to fill it. And you can see the thinking here of what we would like to do. And that is to say that 7/10 of the position would continue to be the traditional high school principal role to support the overall function of the building. And we would turn to Mike Piscatelli and his team to think about how those kinds of duties are distributed across his whole team. But in general, it would be a traditional assistant principal role. But we would like point 3 of that role to be dedicated to the work around equity, diversity, inclusivity, and anti-racism in the high school, but also with a helping hand toward the district. And there's 2 big points I want to make here. I know I've said a lot about declining enrollment, and I suppose an argument could be made that with declining enrollment, maybe we don't need this administrative position. But I think that with the return of students in the fall full time, we're going to see a lot of duties return as well. Maybe a very simple one to mention is we've had just about 0 discipline in the high school this school year. You know, I know I report to you every Friday the number of suspensions, and most weeks it's none. But I do believe, and Mike Piscatelli would agree, that when students come back, we're going to have, I think, maybe not discipline issues, but I think we're going to have a lot of student needs that will require a full complement of leaders to address those needs outside of the classroom. So that's part of the rationale. And then the other piece, you know, we as a school district have made the work around equity and diversity a priority. And I know we've talked about, could we ever hire a coordinator of equity and diversity? You know, people in the community have said you should have one of these. And we recognize that that's perhaps a big ask when budgets are uncertain. So with this opportunity, we'd like to say this is a step toward focusing on a formalization of that staff time for that work. But in the budget, it's a status quo 1.0 FTE, so it does not represent any increased expenditures. The last change I want to mention here around staffing is really a transition of the type of personnel. Because of some lower enrollments and different ways that we are providing reading services for some of our higher needs students with disabilities, we would like to reduce 1 FTE for special education. This would be a reduction that's offset by attrition, by a retirement. And in that place of an FTE, hire an additional school psychologist. Such an individual in that professional role would help us meet the need for the increased need for social, emotional, mental health services and supports. And also we need additional capacity for psychological evaluations. And we feel like this would be a good use of that personnel at this time. And then here's the big change we want to talk about. School start time. So I feel like I need to refresh everybody's memory on this topic. It's been a long time since we talked about it. So let me kind of remind you of our timeline. Barbara, I know you could do this better than me and you could take it back a decade and a half, but I'm going to start at October 2018. And that is the point at which the Board of Education established a formal start time task force to really look at this issue of our school start time. If you can recall way back when our high school began at 7:25 one of the earliest in the area with a 7:05 drop off. So it was early. And then, if you can recall, back in December of 2008, Rebecca was actually on this committee. We had a research subcommittee of the task force who presented a review of the literature on this topic around sleep patterns of adolescents, et cetera. And Mike Piscatelli led a team who gathered some data about our own students through a variety of surveys. And they presented to us back in December. Right after that, Damian Singleton led, we called it the SWAT team, the Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats team, that looked at some potential scenarios for later start times. And the committee, I think they had 7 or 8 scenarios. And after a lot of discussion, basically said, we need more help with transportation, because every idea got kind of bogged down in how do we make this happen, given where our buildings are, given where our bus garage is, given the traffic on our roads, et cetera. So we hired a group called School Bus Consultants, gave them a ton of data. They presented to the task force in October of 2019, and they shared with us 5 possible scenarios, but only one of them was cost neutral. The others were prohibitively expensive. So we sent them back to the drawing board, and they actually came back with 5 more that were more creative in their approach. And one of them in particular of these scenarios looked promising. So in January and February of last year, which seems like a lifetime ago, School Bus Consultants worked with their transportation department, and they actually created all of the runs for all of the districts to test the feasibility of this plan. They were fine-tuning all of that. They were trying out the runs. They were what I call very close. And then March 2020 happened, and the discussion went on hold. And ironically, we absolutely did change school start times this year, but not what we had planned. So our task force ever so graciously reconvened last week. We had a great turnout of the group. There were well over 30 people there to pick up the discussion, and they have made a recommendation that I'm going to share with you tonight. Before I do that, I'm just going to skate through the research that we talked about in case our community who's watching or others need a refresher on this. But you know, the whole notion is, well, why would we change our school start time? And Rebecca and her research team put together a really comprehensive review of the research on this topic, really looking at the physiology of adolescent sleep and the impact of delayed sleep phase syndrome in our adolescent children. So you can see some of the key points that happen there, and it's a biological shift to a later natural sleep onset and wake times. And as the mom of an adolescent, I can tell you this is true. And so it's resulting in, chronic sleep deficiency globally. Here are some of the recommended sleep durations. This whole idea of, 8.5 to 10 hours a night is optimal. Many of our students don't get that. Benefits of adequate sleep are medical and mental, academic and cognitive, and there's also public safety elements to it as well. And then I won't read all of these, but I think there are important points to remind everyone that there are downsides to not getting enough sleep, and they impact the medical and mental health side of things, and all of those that are listed there. And they also have an impact on academic and cognitive outcomes. So the research has been very compelling. So based on that, and a lot of discussion, and some recent work by Daniel Poirier, our amazing transportation director, we have, one more slide before I get there. This is the data that Mike Piscatelli and his team gathered from our parents and our students about how many hours they sleep at night. And you can see when you look at our high school, 7% get 8 to 9, 1% gets 9 to 10, but 28% of our kids at the high school level only get 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night. So anyway, we know that our students here in Guilderland they're not different than all the others around the world. So with that as an anticlimax, this is the proposed framework for start times for next year. And some of you who were on the committee know that the earlier iteration of this plan actually had Guilderland Elementary School starting at the same time as the high school. That was a function of transportation. Danielle and Jerry Keenan and the team down there were able to figure out how to have all 5 elementary buildings start at the same time, which, as you see, is a 7:45 start with a 7:30 drop off, and then the day flows. The big change is high school would start at 8:20 with an 8:15 drop off. End of the day, 3:15 with a depart of 3:25, late bus of 4:15. Middle school would start a little bit later than it currently does. It's 20 minutes. It's 9:05 start with an 8:55 drop off. Now, I said this was the presentation of asterisks, and you'll notice that there is one there too. This is, and as I said at the bottom, it will require some fine tuning before it's finalized. We've looked at this around the student day and around transportation, but there's probably some tweaking we need to do when we look at the contractual day for teachers and some other things to think about, which I'll share on the next slide, which are the pros and cons. And I'm trying to frame the pros and cons and not as what's good and what's bad, but rather what's good, and then what do we need to problem solve and work on. So what works, the committee last week, and I know the building cabinet at the high school felt very positive about an 8:20 a.m. start time at the high school. Some even said it was ideal. One of the other real pluses here is that this model eliminates the gap between drop off at the high school and when school actually starts. That change is actually more appealing to our leadership team in the high school than anything else, because that was a long period of time when there wasn't great supervision. Students were kind of in limbo. The committee felt that there was a good balance overall of competing priorities across the district, i.e. that doesn't say that this is perfect. It's just balancing the good and the not so good. One of the drawbacks when we were discussing this in the committee years ago was that, boy, we don't want to start the elementary students so early, but we learned firsthand this year in the pandemic that our K2 kids did just fine starting essentially at the same time that we're proposing for next year. And then the last piece from the positive side is that there are no additional costs associated with this. So that's to the creativity and brilliance of the transportation department. Now, there are things that need work. Farnsworth start and end time creates some challenges. So we would have to think about how parents might be able to drop students off early if they need to get to work before the school day starts. We have some ideas about that. The other piece is the late bus at the end of the day. If I go back, you can see that 4:25 is late. And because we don't have numerous late bus runs, some of them could, kids could be getting home pretty late. Transportation to career and technical education at BoCES is also something we need to think through. That program starts at 8 o'clock over at the BoE Center. We also have some ideas there, but that's a problem that needs to be solved. Two others, some concern about lost instructional time for CTE students who are transitioning back and forth between the high school and the BoCES, and also for athletes who may need to leave school early in order to get to away days for competitions. We also have some ideas about that. And then the last one is traffic. I don't know how we exactly solve that, but it is something on everybody's mind. So I think I have just a couple more things for the board to think about. Each year, I share a slide kind of like this, that in March, we don't know exactly what our resources will be, but I'd like to suggest some things that if we get more, it would mean a lot to our programming. And one of those is to expand our instructional coaching model. You know, we had terrific success with it at Linwood. We have done a little bit of it in our buildings this year, trying to keep it alive. We would love to do more. It's a great model for supporting both students and teachers and promoting professional growth in order to help students grow too. And then the second idea here goes back to Neil's many comments about where we are with our fund balance. If we have some additional funds, we would prefer to not use that extra $350,000 to balance the budget. It's uncomfortable to be 13 of 13 when you think about the fund balance that we have available to us. There may be other ideas, but those are two top priorities. So kind of wrapping up here, I see this as a budget that's trying to balance hope with uncertainty. But as always, we made a plan here that puts students first, and we're looking at the long run. It's not the short race. And I think we have to recognize that everyone has been through trauma. And while we suspect there will be needs in the fall, we're not going to know the full extent of them until then. But we also want to listen to our community. We want to respect our taxpayers. We know that the pandemic hurt people unequally. While some may not have felt the impact of it economically, others may have felt it keenly. We want to be respectful of that. And then the unknowns, we're waiting on guidance from the Department of Health, from the State Education Department, and the state needs to finalize its spending plan for next year. And all of those things will impact us. So I'm going to close with this. This is a photo that Emily Minot took one late afternoon when our used to be called Reentry Committee, now called the Recovery Committee, was meeting to talk about the many COVID-related problems that that committee has taken on over the past many months. And I just thought it was great because a rainbow is a sign of hope. The storm has passed, but you always kind of wonder what's on the other side of that, right? So we still have this little uncertainty. So thank you, Emily, for sharing your photo. It's a real, I think, perfect symbol for where we are right now. And then our next steps, 22 minutes ago, we launched a thought exchange for people who want to ask questions that we can address next week. And next week is March 30th. That's when we'll do our workshop, our Q&A. We're scheduled to adopt a budget on April 13th. The spring break is in the middle there. May 4th is our budget hearing, and then the vote is on May 18th. So we have given you a lot of information tonight. So I'll take a deep breath and say, we welcome your questions. Seema.
I just had a question about that American Rescue Plan Act. Is that a definite thing? And if I remember correctly, you said that we have 4 or 5 years to spend those funds? Is
Yes, it's a definite thing. The uncertainty is around exactly how it's going to work out in terms of the actual funding. So we have the 2.5 million. The question is, what kind of rules are going to be around that? I think we'll have some discretion with that. I also think we'll have to use good judgment around that because we do, as I mentioned, that goes out until December of 2024. So we have a multi-year period to consider how to use those funds to serve our students best. And we'll need to take a good look at that once we get a full picture of how the money is allocated, how it's expected to be used. And I think we'll have some decision points about what our emphasis will be and at what points will we need to use that funding to hone in on some of those things that we want to target.
it said that it was for lost learning. I was just wondering if that includes like mental health support and like the trauma that Dr. Wiles just talked about as well.
Yes, the requirement was 20% had to be used for learning loss, but the other 80% can be used in a manner that the school district feels would best benefit its students. So we do have we have a lot of latitude there with the 80%. It's the 20% that was fixed in terms of addressing that one particular area of need.
Thank you, Neil.
Rebecca?
I just had a question. If social distancing is still required in the fall to a lesser extent, but like say the 3 feet that's currently recommended, can we still rely on the assumption that all students will be back full time all day? Like, will there be enough space to accommodate that?
I think in most buildings that will be true. I mean, honestly, if we have a strict 3-foot guideline, Cliff will be making his 3-foot measurer and we'll be looking at classrooms. So I think that'll be something that we'll need to explore. I think for most typical classrooms, desks are already 3 feet apart or can be. But I worry a little bit about the middle school, especially we have some class sizes, 7th grade, that are higher than we would love. So that could be a challenge. So we're going to have to be able to adjust, as we get that guidance.
Okay, thank you.
Barbara?
Yesterday, Blanca and I attended the special ed PTA meeting, and they raised a number of concerns that I wanted to throw out to you as you're developing the budget. One of their concerns was that we appeared, from what they know, to have a co-teaching model and a few classes at the high school, and I think we had one at the middle school, but nothing at the elementary school. And a number of the parents there actually were special ed people, and they pointed out that the bang for the buck is if you intervene early and make these types of classroom situations available in the elementary school. So have we got any plans of doing this on the elementary level? And a secondary question, you mentioned that some of our reading specialists had been sort of pulled away from their duties to be a cohort to a classroom. And they also pointed out that a number of them felt that the reading intervention this year, because of necessity, had fallen off. So I'm wondering if there's any thought to maybe using some of these lost learning funds, for a summer program for reading for the kids that are lagging behind. Another thing that was pointed out, and I don't understand if Blanca may have understood this individual a little bit better, but I thought one of the things that this lady was saying is that the summer school program that we had last year did not have busing. Is that correct?
That's not true. We bused
You
last
did
year.
bus, okay. Because
Families could decide if they didn't want to ride the bus because we know people were uncomfortable with it, but we did provide busing.
Oh, okay. And that was the other thing that, if we have any of these summer school programs for our special ed kids, or any, doesn't even have to be special ed, as somebody pointed out, a lot of our students have fallen behind. And will we provide busing, if we have these programs? And is that potentially in your budget?
So a lot of questions there. And Barbara, thank you for calling me earlier because I was able to get some hard data for you from Lisa Knowles. So we have several co-taught classes across the elementary buildings. There's 3 at GES, 1 at Westmere, 1 at Linwood, 1 at Pine Bush, and there's none at AES, but it's more a function of the numbers of students in a particular grade level who have a certain threshold of needs, where the cluster makes sense to put them together with a co-teacher. These tend to be students who have higher needs for support, who require specialized instruction. So we create them where they are needed. So we do have some across the district, and they tend to shift a little bit every year as students move around or age up or age out into the next level. So if there is a need for a co-taught section and the students to support it with the level of support that's appropriate, we will create that. Otherwise, we use a consultant teacher model, which is designed for students who have IEPs, but whose level of need is less significant. They may need accommodations or, some level of support that's not quite as intensive as specialized instruction, where you have 2 teachers who co-plan, co-teach, co-grade, who together provide the instruction. And then for the summer question, we actually are planning to do a summer program for K-8 students focused on reading and math. This was even before we knew about the CARES Act, to help those students who, and I'm not crazy about the learning loss expression, but those who might need some additional support to be on a good footing for the fall. And Damien was able to kind of reallocate some of our grant funding in other areas in order to support that. Depending on what happens with this new resource from the federal level, we may be able to enhance what we're planning for that. We're really waiting for guidance on that. So I think that was all your questions, Barbara.
Well, those were a few. I have a couple more if it's okay. One of the students mentioned a real life curriculum. And again, we have talked for many, many years about a personal finance course. And I'm just wondering how many students actually took it this year, and if our, guidance counselors are encouraging that particular thing. And let's see, my last question, I think, has to do with the psychologist that you're adding. I think you said at the high school, correct?
Yes, but we look at the psychologist positions kind of district-wide, but right now that's where the need is.
Okay, because what I was wondering, the AP position, to have it more of a, like what the way Amy had it, basically, so that you could fill whatever needs happen to arise. And granted, this diversity, equity, diversity, and inclusion, certainly could be part of the job, but to place it in the job description, I don't know. I'm debating that in my own mind. But
Well, first, Barbara, I have to ask Mike. I don't know off the top of my head how many kids signed up for personal finance, but I can get that data for you. What was the school psychologist position question? Just is it district-wide or high school? Right now, that's where we're seeing, that's where we're seeing the need, particularly around the completion of psychological evaluations. And then for the other position, I don't know if it necessarily needs to be in the job description, but we want to be purposeful about it. So I mean, Amy took on a lot of that work because it was her interest. And she's very able leader in that area. We want to be purposeful about it. So I'm certainly open to more conversation about it. I think Blanca, then, no, Judy, I think you were next, then Blanca, then Seema.
You're muted, Judy.
Good, sorry. A few years ago, Neil, I thought they said that the fund balance, the amount you had in the fund balance could only be a certain amount, and we had to subtract money to get down to that amount. What am I thinking that's wrong about that?
No, we weren't exceeding, well, there is a 4% maximum in terms of what we call unallocated fund balance or unreserved fund balance. So we have money in what I would call just the general savings pot. That's your general fund balance. And then you can also have it in what's called reserve accounts, which is money set aside for a particular purpose. So if we wanted to put aside money for workers' compensation expenses, we could do that. There's about 13 of those specific types of reserves that we could put money into. And the money can only be used for those types of expenses. So we put money into a workers' comp reserve. The only use for that is to pay workers' comp expenses. We can't pay any other type of expenses. So the unappropriated fund balance is what we talked about, the 4% fund balance. That is discretionary. We can use that for whatever purpose we determine. So there is the 4% limit. We do have to work within that. We also can put money in reserve funds, and that counts to that overall fund balance and reserve total.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
Yes. And my other question is very minor, but it looks to me like there's a huge amount in health costs and retirement. You know, both of those went up over $400,000. Is that because of the large number of long tenured employees, or is that just sort of a typical, and that's what we're going to be facing?
Well, the health insurance, it's a larger number, but on a percentage basis, it's about 2.6% increase. So overall, our health insurance expenses are not increasing dramatically. It's just a number of magnitude with the amount of staff we have and a large budget. In terms of the retirement system contributions, that fluctuates over time. The way the retirement system works is money is invested, and it's invested by the retirement system. So what we often see is when the rate increases, earnings are down, and when the rate decreases, investment earnings are up. So they're able to invest in instruments that we can't invest in that have higher rates of return. They manage that, and as those returns help to fund the overall need for money to pay pensions. Right. So if the stock market's doing well, they're invested in the stock market. That's less they need from school districts. However, when the market's not doing well, they have less earnings, so then they have to ask school districts to contribute more. So we're starting to see that upward trend again with interest earnings down. All depends on how the stock market operates and how they make their investments. But we're seeing a little bit of that creep now of investment earnings haven't been where they have been in the past. So they're asking school districts to fund more at the cost.
And
so
that's a long-term thing too. I mean, isn't it, you know?
Yeah. The rates have gone up on TRS have been anywhere from around 0 to over 20%. If you look at it back historically over time. So can fluctuate quite a bit from year to year and over time.
All right. They struck me as being rather large. That was all. Thank you.
Yep.
Blanca?
I have 4 questions. Okay, but I'll be fast. Neil, so are we looking at a 1.8% tax increase?
Overall. Yep.
I missed that. Your mic was off, sorry.
Oh, yes,
Okay,
that's
right. So we're not,
right. I'm sorry, excuse me, it's 1.28%. The
1.2.
budget's going up 1.8%. The tax levy is 1.28%.
Okay, so that's what folks are gonna feel in the community is a 1.2%.
Yeah, that's the current estimate on what the tax rate increase would be per thousand.
Okay. So I guess I'm wondering, I don't feel like we're getting more, but yet we're asking taxpayers to pay more. So I'll just leave that comment there. It may be beyond me. I may need to look at this a little more, but I don't think I didn't see, I saw a lot of trading of money or salaries, etc., but I didn't really see us getting something extra. And we're also, Pat Fahey just told us that we're getting some funding. So I wonder if folks in the community will wonder why we're getting this money, but we still have to have, pay more in taxes. So I just want to put that out there. I'm all for hiring another psychologist, but can we really afford to lose a special ed teacher, especially based on the meeting that Barb and I attended yesterday? That poses a concern to me. But again, Marie, you can get back to me with that. I guess I worry, do we need this special ed teacher? Should we replace her instead of replacing her with a psychologist? We do need a psychologist, but then we want to fill Amy's position, and Amy was wonderful. But is this the right time to fill that position when we're not going to be keeping a special ed teacher, or we have to pick between a special ed teacher and a psychologist? So those are the sorts of things that are concerning to me. If we were to fill Amy's position, I'm all in on the being specific and intentional, like you have it written. And I would actually propose that we also add anti-bullying as something that they take on in their role. So those are my comments / concerns. I don't know who wants to address them.
Blanca, I'll just jump in on the special ed position. That too is an enrollment driven position spot. So we have fewer students at the high school, including students who would have been in this particular well, we just have fewer students to fill the spot for that program. So it's not as if we're reducing any kind of programming for any student or any ratio for providing services for students. It's really enrollment driven. There are fewer students. So it's not like there's less opportunity to support children because of their needs. The other thing I'll point out that and this is part of actually tomorrow night's presentation, we've actually added many special education teachers over the last 5 years. We're up 16 positions in the last 5 years. So we have a very robust special education staff across the district. So I'll just put that out there. It's 100% driven by enrollment. And then I don't know if we want to talk about some of the other things, or we can get to Seema's question, and then, because that's kind of a bigger philosophical question about what we're asking our taxpayers to do. But Seema, why don't I go to you and we can come back?
Okay, I have one clarification and then a couple of questions. So you said the unassigned, I know we normally have fewer unassigned, but they're higher because there's lower enrollment at the high school. And so you're moving, instead of replacing them, you're moving those positions to have flexibility at the unassigned?
Yes.
Okay. And then my question is about the bargaining units, if there are any fiscal implications that we need to think about. Also, the tax base, if the assessments have been pretty steady. And then the last one is just a comment that I would say we need to fill the AP position because students are going to be coming back. It'll be totally different than not having, as many students in the building. So I don't think having, less administrators or fewer adults in the building is going to be helpful.
Neil, do you want to talk about tax base and assessments? I'm not sure if we've gotten any new information about that of late. But
Yeah, we won't have that information until really toward the end of June, the beginning of July. We don't get the tax base information until May itself. So we won't have that information. We have typically carried forward, assuming that we're going to have the same tax base going forward. In other years, when we've had continued growth, which we did for a number of years in our district, we would have added a factor for that and assumed that. But with the current economic situation, we've not assumed any growth in the tax base. We have also not assumed any reduction in the tax base. So we do have some settlements, commercial tax settlements, that are prospective in nature, so that doesn't require a refund. We also have gone through a number, I would say the majority of the residential tax challenges have been settled from last year. We have some for the current year that are being adjudicated, but all of the ones from last year and really tied to the reval that was done in 2019 in the town of Gilliland have all been completed. So there's not as much susceptibility there. So there's some susceptibility, but we have treated it as not more growth in terms of assessed value, but continuing to hold where it is.
And then you asked about bargaining units, Seema. What would you like us to address?
Just any financial implications. I know you kind of touched upon it before Judy's questions with the healthcare contribution, so maybe you already kind of answered that. Yes.
I think Kelly and then Gloria.
Hi. So I have a quick question. With all the federal money that should be coming our way that we just spoke about, the budget doesn't seem to reflect any big significant increases. I was kind of expecting some big significant money to come in. At least that's what we heard Ms. Fahey say about and talk about and what we've kind of seen. So what am I missing? Like, where is that money going?
Kelly, that is such a phenomenal question. So just a couple really important points to keep in mind that in the the executive budget, which is what we've presented tonight, that's all we have until the state adopts a budget. Huge portions of our state aid is backfilled with previous federal dollars. So Neil demonstrated we have $4 million put in and almost $4 million taken out. So we have the potential next year, if that $4 million it's taken out is not plugged by additional something, whether federal dollars or renewed local state funds, we're going to have a huge hole to fill. So I'll just go back to 2009, 10, 11, 12. And some of the board members will remember this painfully. We had a terrible economic downturn. A federal stimulus package came along. It was called ERA. It plugged the funding hole that was in all of the school district budgets because the state was short on revenue. And then the ERA money went away. And we got the gap elimination adjustment. And we laid off 229 people over 2 or 3 years. So right now, as of tonight, we're promised this $2.5 million, but we don't know how much of the actual state aid coming our way for next year will be federally provided money to close a state funding gap or not. So I think this is a really important time to realize that we're likely to need that $2.5 million just to maintain the status quo in 22, 23 and 23, 24. Now, that doesn't mean that if we have some pressing needs and no other resources to do what we need to, that we couldn't look at some of that. But I will say, and people can disagree with me, that in order to sustain and preserve what we're planning for next year to meet student needs, beyond that, we have to hang on to that big federal, whatever it's going to end up looking like, package for us. It would be a disaster to spend it all, and then we wouldn't have any money. There's no money to replace it once you spend it. It's one time.
When you say hang on to, does that mean go into fund balance?
Well, that's one thing we don't know right now, is how it will be allocated to us. We're not going to get a check for $2.5 million. I can guarantee you that 100%. It's probably going to be allocated to us through some mechanism adjudicated by the state education department, where we'll have to write a plan, submit it to a portal, have expenses and get them reimbursed, or something like we do for Title I funding. Neil, you're welcome to jump in on your thoughts, because we're not going to get a check. I think that's
right. The money will be distributed over time, and I think they'll want to see a plan. And there's, I listed a few of the things the money can be used for. The federal money, there's 18 in total. I picked the predominant ones that I thought would affect us, but it's not open-ended. We can't use it for any purpose for which we want. It has to fit one of the 18 criteria in order for us to get reimbursed. And all we have at this point, as Marie said, is an executive budget proposal. We don't have the final state budget, so we don't know where they're going to land. And the other key piece is how much of that federal money is supplanting state money. It's supposed to be in addition to, not in exchange for. All of that we haven't seen yet. So right now, details are pretty sketchy. I mean, everything that I talked about tonight is basically stuff that I was able to pull from other analysis. We have not received any official information as a school district on even here's how much. We've seen the allocation on a piece of paper, but here's how much, here's how you go about getting it, here's what you can use it for. All of those pieces, the actual implementation pieces, we have not seen yet.
sorry,
So
Kelly.
So I'm assuming we'll get that information though before we finalize this budget. And do we have
the state piece will be helpful, because the idea here is how much is the federal money going to be offset by a reduction in state aid. So that's the key piece. So if the idea is you're getting federal money as a school district, and the state wants to say, okay, because you're getting federal money, the state can pull back its support for education, and basically you're in a cost neutral situation, you haven't gained at all. That's what we have to be concerned with, and make sure that we actually have additional money.
Is there in my world, I would call it a decrement list, I guess, but like a list of our wish list of things that, like, if say we got what we wanted, like say you got $2 million jumped into the pot, is there a priority list of how you would wish to spend this money, or we're just assuming we're gonna need it to, remain neutral, I guess you can say?
Well, it's a hypothetical, but we're just not going to get all that money all at once. So I think the thing to think about, and we provided a couple ideas, like, for example, we would love to expand our literacy coaching model that has powerful impact on improving reading outcomes in our elementary schools. We have that data. It's just, we have been very careful with resources in order to expand that. So that would be something. I do think we would think about summer programming, other kinds of things to help students who may have, struggled during this past year. But the reality is, we can't, in my opinion, we can't spend it all on a couple programs for 1 or 2 years, because then the money will be gone and we'll have hired people that we can no longer pay. So you really have to look at it for the long haul to get us through to such a point when state revenues and the state economy are recovered enough where we're not depending on a federal relief package to survive. I mean, it's a relief package because the state doesn't have the revenue to keep us afloat, doing the kinds of things that we talked about tonight. It's very complicated to think about. It's not straightforward at all. So,
One of the other things you can think about is it's like taking money out of your savings account for a short-term need. So I have money in the bank, I need it for a certain purpose, or I want to spend it in a certain way. But if you can't replace it, at some point now you've got this extra expense and you don't have any way to basically get out of it without reducing your expenses down the road. You have to scale back at that point. So it's the same idea. It's a pot of money that's available to you now. Once it's gone, you have to adjust again.
or it's like people who win the lottery and 5 years down the road, they're completely broke because they had a lot of resources, overspent in the immediate, and then couldn't, pay the taxes on the mansion that they bought, or, whatever it is. So those are the kinds of things that we need more information on, but we need to be careful so we're not spending and then having to make terrible cuts.
I just think that people like Pat Fahey and our legislators are working really hard to get us this money. It feels like we really need to use the money when we have it. So just my 2 cents.
We just don't have it yet, Kelly.
I understand. I understand the caution, but my 2 cents.
Thanks, Kelly. Gloria?
I guess I just want to say my initial impression tonight. I like the way your proposals kind of mirror some of the thought exchange ideas. I think, we asked the community for input. We asked the students, the parents, we asked the board, and I like some of the ideas I've heard, especially the important ideas that came across in the thought exchanges, maintaining the class sizes, maintaining programming and curriculum and not cutting there, keeping sports, clubs and things like that, holding on to staff. So, I think we're honoring the community with the kinds of things that you've put forth in this budget. I won't repeat, but, just kind of, I ditto some of the comments that have been made about the importance of the school psychologist and the AP position. I think it's wise to have the extra reserve positions because we just don't know what this is going to be like. This is going to be a whole new, these kids are coming back after a whole year of trauma, as you said, and the staff as well. So we really don't know what the needs are going to be. My only big concern regarding the whole thing, and as I'm sure you could predict, is the middle school, the schedule change. I think it's a extremely stressful change for the middle school. Having been a middle school teacher for so many years and knowing how often we tried every year to get that schedule early, to see it go a half hour later is just mind-boggling to me. And I really feel for those kids. And again, the middle school gets squished in the center. I'm very concerned about that move, that change.
Gloria, I would agree, but this year it's just about the same time. So it's almost like we've gotten used to it being that. I hate it that it's that late. But
I don't know if we've done enough to know what the stress is on that, because I know, having been there and also raised raised kids in that stressful thing, trying to get to a music lesson, trying to get to a doctor's appointment, pulling kids out for this or for that. Now we're talking kids getting home almost 5 o'clock with some bus runs, maybe even later. Shove dinner in their mouth and run off to something. What kind of a family life is that going to be? I just think the stress of that kind of a pace, they're going to pay the price for that. But that's just my thoughts.
Barbara, I see your hand, but I also heard from Mike Piscatelli in the interim. There were 49 students enrolled in personal finance this year. There's 38 requests for next year. And he says this is mostly a senior level course and enrollment is dropping the most in their senior level. So that's why that is the way it is.
I just wanted to follow up with what Gloria said. I think there's a 20-minute time change, isn't there, with the middle school versus half an hour? I mean, 20 minutes is still 20 minutes, but that's still better than 30. That's it. Thank you.
All right. Well, this has been a little bit of a marathon for all of you. So you have the full budget, you have the appendices, you have the PowerPoint. Um, when we are back together again next Tuesday, we'll have the bank of questions that we get from the thought exchange. If there are some particular areas that get lots of questions, we will invite some of our leadership team members to come and answer detailed things if necessary. But there will be more time for all of you to continue to ask questions. And obviously, if you think of more between now and then, you don't have to wait. But we'll also have kind of a workshop approach to the conversation too. Neil has a kind of a one-page summary that we work from. And perhaps, I don't know if it's possible, but maybe on the 30th, we'll have a little more clarity about either the state and or the federal funding. So any other comments, questions, thoughts? Blanca?
Just to thank you. I mean, this is a lot of work, and for me to come in here as a first termer and ask you all these questions live and be critical of it, it cannot be fun for you. And I just want you to know I recognize you put in a lot of work for it into this, and I think it's actually pretty good. If I had to choose between voting or not voting tomorrow, I would probably vote for it. So.
Well, thank you, Blanca. And I'll just say, this is a team effort. You know, Neil puts in a ton of work, but it's the culmination of our whole leadership team who do the hard work of trying to figure out what a kid's need, and then we build up from there. So we appreciate the challenging questions because they inevitably result in a better product when we bring it to our voters in May. So we're all big boys and girls. You can ask hard questions. Kelly?
Before COVID, the opportunities for the community to ask questions about the public, about the budget was done. I don't even remember. I don't know if I was on the board then, thinking back at this point, but it was done in a public format. They would come to the board meeting and ask a question with a piece of paper, stand at the mic. Is that, I can't remember.
Well, we've done probably 30 different things over the years. Sometimes we had live forums and many people would come. We've also expanded the electronic, so people could send their questions in and we would ask them. We've used surveys, but yeah, it's been, I don't know, I'm looking at Gloria from the communication policy committee, because we've tried, I don't know, 20 things, it seems to me, over the years.
And I think the thing that we found was the more opportunities we presented people with, we constantly stressed there were board meetings to talk at. You could come, you could send comments. We constantly said that. You know, we seem to get a better read on the budget. I mean, the public seemed to be more positive about things because we kept the lines of communication open. And there were formal evenings, but we did it electronically because people just didn't want to come out. The numbers that were coming out were so small. So we found that giving that electronic, option, people could type in. We had one time where they just typed in the questions and BoCE's moderators gathered them and passed them over to the, to the board, to the administration to answer. So we've tried a lot of variety of ways, and the more we come up with, they seem to work.
Ironically, when we've done our reopening forums or we've gotten more input and questions from the community in this COVID environment when we send out either a Google Doc or a thought exchange. I mean, our reopening, we had hundreds and hundreds of questions. And I'm thinking we're going to get quite a few on the thought exchange regarding the budget as well, because it's kind of like a reopening. It's like reopening 2.0.
Right. I'm just getting at, I guess, I'm wondering, and in the past when we brought it up, I'm like, I like this online forum. Personally, for me, it's easier. because I can say kiss my kid goodnight, and it really works for me. But I'm wondering what the best format is for the public. And I know we talked about it last time. Luciana brought it up about the thoughts of going back. Since our kids will be going back, we should likely be going back into, the world here. I just want to get people's thoughts as we present our budget and engage with the community more.
Well, I
Sure.
just remember those kinds of nights we started doing, well, we were doing those community conversations, and it got to, I think, the third year, and it was basically, we were sitting there talking to the staff, to the administrators, and the public wasn't coming to them. It just coming out at night it's a stretch. People are working all day, they have family, and it was so much easier and more convenient to take advantage of these other methods, and there were a number of methods they could use to get the input. But coming out physically, it was dwindling. We were sitting there talking to ourselves, which wasn't very helpful.
I mean, I haven't been on as long as Gloria, but I remember going in different parts of LGI and in your hallway so people could come talk to us about different things, and there was nobody there.
In the early days of when I referenced all those huge cuts we had to make, we had a lot of people, but it was because we were really in a very difficult spot. And I'm hoping, and I'm sure we all agree, no one wants no one wants to go back to that scenario. Love to see people, but
Okay, so can I have a motion to adjourn? Barb, second Gloria, all in favor? Aye. Passes 9-0. 8-0, or Ben is frozen. 9-0.
no,
Okay.
good.
Passes. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night,
Good night.
everyone. Thank you so
Good night,
much.
everyone.
Thanks
Bye.
for your time.